For today's podcast, we're going to be looking at the book First Timothy, or the letter of First Timothy, or the first letter written to Timothy, or the first letter written by Timothy. The pastoral letters have long since not been thought to have been authentically written by Paul, although there is a lot of discussion and debate going all the way back to the original Beacon Bible commentaries. I've been reading, studying some of that. Let's see, when was these? This was copyright 1965, but I believe portions of this was written before that. Anyway, I'm just reading people on the editorial board. Some of these people I met when I was a wee child. Some of these people were in our house when we lived in Scotland. Most of the New Testament is a collection of letters that we attribute to Paul. But did Paul really write all of these letters? Probably not. There are two books that most likely were really written by Paul, although Paul probably did use a scribe to help him write them. But Romans and Galatians are two of the letters that most likely were written entirely by Paul. Then we have others of these letters that I kind of call like group projects. You know, other people wrote them as well. 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, 2 Corinthians, and 1 Corinthians were written by Paul and others. 1 Thessalonians was written by Paul, Silas, and Timothy together. The book Philippians and 2 Corinthians was written by Paul and Timothy, and 1 Corinthians was written by Paul and Sosthenes. There are some books that were not written by Paul. In all likelihood, it is believed that these letters were written after Paul had died. So if Paul had died, then Paul did not write them. The people writing them may have used things that they remember Paul saying. But Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus were not authentically written by Paul. Ephesians was written by Amanuensis. Colossians was written by Timothy. 2 Thessalonians was written by Silas and Timothy. 1 and 2 Timothy were written by Timothy. And Titus was also written by Amanuensis. So, in summary, when we're looking at the Pauline letters, there are some that were written by Paul, there were some that were partially written by Paul, and some that were not written by Paul. Paul is the author of Romans and Galatians. Paul was a participant in the writing of 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, 2 Corinthians, and 1 Corinthians. And the books of Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus were not actually written by Paul. There are some things that we find in the letter supposedly to Timothy, although I believe 1 Timothy was actually written by Timothy, perhaps embellishing on the things Paul had kind of instructed him about being a pastor or the leader of a church or religious group. And so while we can find instruction in these pastoral letters for everyone, we do need to realize that the intended audience of these pastoral letters were not to whole churches, but were what seems to be letters that were written to people that were in ministry. Do we need to hold our ministers to a higher standard? Yeah, probably, because they have greater impact for good or bad on other people. There are some things we find in the book of Timothy that, and I'm going to call these the writings of Timothy, although they are written as if they were to Timothy from Paul. I think Timothy wrote these perhaps with some of the things that Paul had given him as guidance and instruction, but perhaps embellished on them. There are some things that we know in the authentic letters of Paul that seem to not match up with this. And so I want to bring to light one passage here from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. I do not believe that Paul said those words. There are other things that Paul have written that leads me to believe that no, Paul did not say this. Timothy, on the other hand, probably did say this. I can probably, with a great amount of certainty, hypothesize that Timothy was sexist. And so at that time, in the culture of that time, women already were not considered equivalent or within the same level of acceptance as males. And so I don't have a problem looking at the Bible and reading in 1 Timothy and reading this, what Timothy says about women in the church, and just clearly saying, this is wrong. Do I believe Timothy wrote this as if Paul said it and spread this around? Yes, I believe that there were sexist men back during the days of the early church. There is sexism embedded in many churches today, so we shouldn't be surprised that we find this here. And the sexism in today's church comes to this scripture to propel their devious and deviant theology. So I don't have a problem reading through portions of the Bible and say, this is wrong. I can find this in the Bible. Do I think this was translated correctly? Probably so. Probably Timothy actually wrote this and actually shared this as if it was coming from Paul. And if Paul really did say this to Timothy, it just doesn't seem to jive with some of the other things that we do authentically attribute to Paul. But this scripture we find in 1 Timothy chapter 2 is incorrect. Yes, it's in the biblical text. Yes, this is a translation of what was originally stated there. There is not a group of people that says, no, just some evil sexist men in the 1950s put that in there. That's not what it says. No, we really think this is what it really said. It's just wrong. It's just bad theology, and it was wrong. So first, Timothy is not a person I'd really want to hang out with. If Timothy was a contemporary person, he'd be one of those people who are, I wouldn't go to church with this person named Timothy. And if this person, Timothy, was my preacher, he would be a former preacher, because I could not go to a church that listened to a man who actually preached this garbage and trash. Now, when I'm looking at the error of what is stated here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, I'm not trying to say this is a translation error. This is a theology error straight from the brain of Timothy. Maybe Paul. I don't think Paul had anything to do with this. So I don't think I have much trouble getting a lot of people to agree with me that here's something in the Bible that's wrong. There's another problem in 1 Timothy that I would like to draw our attention to, and this is 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 11. And I want to read this out of my Everyday Bible, which is NRSV UE. First Timothy chapter 1, starting with verse 9. I got to back up to verse 8. Now we know that the law is good if one uses it legitimately. This means understanding that the law is laid down not for the righteous, but for the lawless and the disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their father or mother or murderers, the sexually immoral, men who engage in illicit sex, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to the sound teaching that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I am entrusted. Now, some of the modern English versions that have been perverted by the 20th and 21st century have taken this translation of something called illicit sex and just used the word for perverts, people who have perverted the truth of God. Now, it's kind of interesting when I go back to the 1960s Wesleyan Armenian theologians, when they're talking about the perversions, and you got to know that they were using the King James Version, where they really keyed in on this term of perversions. And they were talking about people who had perverted the Christian way, against whom he is warning the teachers of the law. They were distorting God's words to serve their evil purposes. So the Wesleyan Armenian theologians here are not talking about perverts as sexual perverts, but the perverts were people that were perverting the Christian way. They were twisting the law, the teachers of the law, into meanings to serve their own evil purposes and what they could gain. So they're talking about people that were the preachers, and they were twisting, perverting the message that Jesus shared. Remember, we're talking in the New Testament, the early Christian church was all about the life lessons and teachings of Jesus, and they were perverting and twisting those to serve their own purposes. Who was doing this? The preachers, the teachers of the law. They were perverting and twisting things. Now, some English versions call this illicit sex. Some of the 20th and 21st century English translations have decided that this would be a good place to put in the word homosexual. There is nothing from the original writings that can authentically lead us to believe that this was talking about homosexuality. It wasn't. The words in Greek that were used here do not translate to that. And homosexuality was known, understood in Greek society at the time of this writing. So that's not what it would have been about. The NRSV UE here translate that Greek word that even says in the footnotes, meaning in Greek was unclear. But they use the words illicit sex here, not homosexuality, because the word does not translate to homosexuality. This is not a verse that you can use to clobber and beat up on gay people, although there is no shortage of religious people that want to say that's what this is about. So they talk about illicit sex. So I looked up illicit sex, and here's what I found. Illicit sex. Sex with a minor. Adultery. Prostitution. Sexual activity in public places. We have to be very careful that we are showing the inclusive love of God. And we have to be very careful not to make stuff up. And there's a lot of theology that is just made up in today's church. And so I always like going back to a Bible commentary from the 1960s and looking at the discussion, especially when I see the editors here were people that were invited into my home when I was in first and second grade. Because we were Americans living in Scotland, there was a misconception that, oh, you're Americans from the Nazarene Church living in Scotland, so you will know all of the other Nazarene Americans when they come over to the British Isles, which, no, we didn't already know them, but we did find ourselves, my mother picking them up at the airport in our Volkswagen van and driving them on to the next church and feeding them and having them in our home. So some of the theology greats in the Nazarene Church of that time are people that I've actually some of them have met and had them in my home when I was a wee boy. So, when we're looking at the New International Version, which really started out good in the 70s, but through the 80s, and then even the 21st century revisions have really, really perverted the biblical text by finding more ways we can put the word homosexual in the Bible. So the very unsophisticated and gullible people that think that every Bible, no matter which one you pick up, is 100% accurate with no mistakes, they're going to believe that this scripture is all about them gay people. Illicit sex might be a good translation for what the original Greek was saying. Illicit sex, sex with a minor. And we're not talking about, is it a man having sex with a minor male or a man having sex with a minor female? Or could this be a female adult having sex with a minor of male or female gender? Illicit sex is sex with a minor. The gender of the perpetrator or the victim is not relevant to this. Adultery. Adultery, we consider adultery sex outside the bounds of marriage. Quite often we say, if you're married to one person and you're having an affair with someone else, then that's adultery. That would fall under the definition of illicit sex. Prostitution falls under the definition of illicit sex. Sexual activity in a public place. So even if you are married to someone and you're downtown and you hide behind a tree, but people see you and you're having sex in the park, that would be considered illicit sex. This means understanding that the law is laid down, not for the righteous, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their father or mother or murderers, the sexually immoral, men who engage in illicit sex. So they're saying men who engage in illicit sex. So men who have sex with minors, or men who have adultery, men who engage in prostitution. Does that mean they're the prostitute or they're paying for a prostitute? Or men who have sexual activity in public places. But who are these people that are doing this? Is it giving me examples of who these lawless people are? Do you want to be a lawless person? Probably not. Liars, perjurers. Liars and perjurers. Liars and perjurers are listed in this same group. So are we really talking about homosexuality here? No. Are we talking about people who have illicit sex? Maybe, but that's in this long list of stuff. We're not talking just about people who engage in illicit sex. We're talking about this group of people that, yeah, they might be engaging in illicit sex, or they might be liars or perjurers. When you read and study 1 Peter, it's probably not safe to study just one or two translations. It's also not safe to use the newest version, the New International Version, because we already know that it has perverted the translation process. I encourage you, when you study the letter 1 Timothy, to look at various translations. Perhaps look at one of the older King James versions, and perhaps one that was published around 1920, 1930. Also look at some paraphrases. Also look at some commentaries. Also make sure that your eyes are open, your ears are open, your mind is open. We started out looking at 1 Timothy, and we started out just looking at the sexism that's there. that I don't believe Paul wrote. I think Timothy wrote some things and tried to blame Paul on it. And then we also look at something else that Timothy was trying to say. And you cannot pervert the life lessons of teachings of Jesus and go over there and tell these people what it is they are or are not supposed to do according to how you have perverted the life lessons and teachings of Jesus. You can't be a pervert. And when I'm talking about being a pervert, you can't be the person who goes and perverts the life lessons and teachings of Jesus to say something that Jesus's life lessons and teachings did not say. You can't take an English version of the Bible and say, oh, this is talking about pedophilia, rape, and prostitution. But hey, even though we know this is about pedophilia and rape, let's say it's about the homosexuals. Yeah, good job. Let's do that. Let's do that. Yeah. And we'll put this out under a translation correction so that we can get all these people to know that we are smarter than Jesus was. And we're going to take care of this for Jesus because we think Jesus didn't quite do it right. So, I hope you've engaged in this with me. I feel a little bad because I didn't go through 1 Timothy and pull out some good things to talk to you about. But I am a victim of Bible abuse. And I am a victim of these 7 clobber passages in the Bible. And one of them happens to fall in 1 Timothy. And it is a perversion of the teachings of Jesus. We have actually perverted the actual writings of Timothy or Paul and Timothy to say something that even Timothy did not mean at that time. And then in the next chapter, we can see something that Timothy wrote that was not of God. You know, Timothy telling those women, y'all sit down, stop talking to the men like you're going to give them instruction. You're not qualified to do that. So, we got lots of things going on here. We've got where Timothy actually said some things wrong. And we've got where the contemporary church has mistranslated what Timothy had to say. So what are you going to do when you pick up a Bible and you read something and say, you know, that can't be right? Well, then you question it and you pray about it. And you really reflect on the life lessons and teachings of Jesus. And if something written in Timothy or in any of Paul's letters doesn't seem to match with the life lessons and teachings of Jesus, there's your answer. There's your answer. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe.